Hi, Founder fans. Jason here once again with Michael Troy for our Generally Speaking series. This week, we're going to have a lot of fun. Two more foreigners for you. We got Thomas Conway, boo, and Baron von Steuben, yay, who I'm probably going to mispronounce his last name at various times throughout this discussion. But, Michael, of course, thank you so much for coming back.
Pleasure to be here as always.
All right, let's get into the heart and core of this, which is Thomas Conway. He's a little bit controversial.
He is. He had a bad year, which gets him a lot of bad press, but his heart was in the right place. Um, he is a Irish by birth, but moved to France very young age. I think like 6 years old with his family. They were Catholics. They weren't doing very well in Ireland because of British rule, and they moved to France. Um, his father had been a man of substance in Ireland. He'd been a viscount, um, but but as I said, because of the issues with the British and Catholics, they had to move to France. His father took a position as an officer in what was called the Irish Brigade of the French Army, and these were all Irish expats who moved to France and joined the French Army because they wanted to fight with their fellow Catholics. Uh, at a very young age, Conway joined his father's regiment as I guess, a cornet, the lowest officer you could be, and began his military career.
Right. And from my understanding, it's pretty successful. He moves his way up the ranks through the years. Uh, I don't know of him becoming, any type of. Does he even reach colonel or the equivalent in the French army?
Uh, no, he actually fights in the 7 Years' War. He's about in his 20s at that time, but he doesn't rise in rank at all during the war, which is very unusual. Usually, officers move up in rank as the armies get larger and officers above them die off. He didn't rise in rank at all, and I'm not sure why, and I can't find any specifics on where he fought in the war either. So he may have just kind of had a civilian job in the background, or not civilian. He was an officer in the military, but a non-combat role, I guess I should say.
Right.
Um, he did make captain after the war in
Okay.
1765. So he got promoted after that, and then after that, through the peacetime period, he actually made his rise through the ranks to eventually reaching colonel in the 1770s.
Okay, so he does chief colonel because I don't know of him having a career outside of a military career.
No, I don't think he did. He was a professional soldier. As I said, fought in the Irish Brigade for the French Army for his entire career, which by the 1770s was about 20 years of service.
Right. So when Silas Dean comes around France looking for officers to send over to North America, it seems like a perfect opportunity for this guy because, well, France doesn't have much of a war to be fighting in at the time.
Right, and this was very common for officers all over Europe. If there was no war going on, you went and found another war because that gave you more experience and opportunities for advancement. It's not clear whether Conway had some special love of the American cause or just really wanted to kill Brits or again was just looking for advancement in the army. We don't really know a whole lot about his motives, but he did seek out Silas Dean. Dean thought he was a particularly good officer, not only because of his years of experience, but also because he spoke English, which was unusual among top French professional officers. So he came over to Europe, to America rather early. I believe it in late 1776. Um,
He
and
travels with not to was it Coudray?
de Caldray, yeah.
Yeah.
I think they came over on a ship together with a bunch of other officers who took lesser ranks. Not every French officer who came over got to be a general. Came over with some who got to be colonels and majors and captains. Uh, and they even by this time, by the time of his arrival, Congress was a little bit skeptical about taking on more French officers. They'd had some really bad experiences with the first couple that they had taken on, and they weren't really keen on bringing on a lot more. Now, Conway, as I said, had an easier time than most because he spoke English, and that had been a real issue for some of the other officers they brought in. They constantly had to have translators with them. It took time and trouble to, translate information back and forth. Conway didn't have that problem. He spoke perfect English. They thought, okay, we'll give this guy a try. And they made him a general relatively quickly, a brigadier. Ducaldre, who came over with him, did not speak English, and he ended up cooling his heels in Philadelphia for many months before he would get a commission.
As we spoke about a few weeks ago when we focused on him.
Right.
Now, I do understand that, uh, as I said, it gets a little controversial with Conway in a minute, but his actual service in the war seems to be uh, above average, we'll say. I understand he leads men in at least one battle. Is it Monmouth or Brandywine? My
Uh,
memory's failing.
Even before the Philadelphia campaign, he was involved in um, he got assigned to Lord Stirling in northern New Jersey when he first joined the army. And at that point, the British were still in New York City, and they made some forays into New Jersey to, for whatever reason, Hal never really explained whether he was trying to keep them off guard or do something useful or whatever. But in any event, they marched into northern New Jersey a few times to stir things up. And so Conway had his first battle experience at the Battle of Short Hills in northern New Jersey before the British got on ships and headed down the Chesapeake to start the Philadelphia campaign. So he did fight at Short Hills under Lord Stirling. He didn't get any kind of exceptional notice for this, but neither did he embarrass himself like some of the French officers that came before. He seemed to be a capable officer, in the relatively small battle that he fought in. Um, During the Philadelphia campaign, he fought at Brandywine and again seemed to acquit himself reasonably well. It's not like he did anything amazing to stand out, but seemed to be a reasonable, capable officer. Overall, the battle was a loss, not his fault, but that's what happened. He fought again at Germantown. Again, seemed to do a reasonably good job, but not special. Um, Conway, however, would disagree with my assessment. He thought he did just an amazing job, and he was more than ready to be promoted to Major General by this time. And I think he didn't really say this, but I strongly suspect that part of the reason was that all these other guys were getting Major General commissions, including Lafayette, who came over from France as a captain and was immediately promoted to Major General.
and
So,
and a child.
yeah, he's 19, 20 years old at the time. So so Conway starts making the argument that, hey, why aren't I a major general? I've done all these amazing things in all these battles. You're promoting these kids over top of me. Somebody who would have been 3 or 4 ranks down below me in the French army is now my commander. Come on. So he makes the case to Washington. Washington's like, yeah, no, sorry. So he goes over Washington's head and starts reaching out to members of Congress saying, hey guys, where's my Major General's commission? And it's interesting, Washington actually opposes it. Some of the members of Congress reach out to Washington and say, what do you think about this guy? What's your assessment? And I like what Lee or what Washington writes to Richard Henry Lee, who's on the committee in Congress that makes these decisions. His response, he says, General Conway's merit then as an officer and his importance in the Army exist more in his own imagination than in reality. So yeah, he
Yeah,
thinks he's hot stuff. We don't necessarily so much.
right.
Um, as I said, Washington didn't think he was a horrible officer. He just didn't think he was outstanding and worth you know moving up the chain really quickly. One of the reasons Washington felt this way, I mean, he may have felt that way personally, but one of the other reasons he felt that way was he was dealing with a bunch of American officers, brigadiers and colonels and stuff like that, who were really kind of upset that all these French officers were coming over and quickly being added or promoted over them. There were a lot more senior brigadiers in the army above um, um, General Conway, and to promote him above these more senior brigadiers was going to annoy a whole lot of people. So Washington said, no, leave him a brigadier for now. This is, not something we want to mess with.
Especially he'd only been there for less than a year. He'd only been in the United States.
Yeah, it's about a year by
About
this
a
time.
year, yeah, which is less time than most of these people had been actively fighting a war, let alone been in the country.
Well, yeah, but from Conway's perspective, Lafayette had been there a month and he was a freaking major general. Come on.
Yeah, sure, but he's an exceptional young man.
Well, he knew people in high places more than anything. But yeah,
Okay, well, you're a little bit more Conway sympathetic than I anticipated this conversation to go, which is
yeah.
great to be objective historically, but a lot of people who study the American Revolution have quite a distaste for Conway.
Well, as I'm saying, so far I think behaved maybe a little pushy, but reasonably so. I think
Right.
he starts to go off the rails after this point.
Almost,
Uh,
almost as soon as he's appointed. I guess we're skipping ahead, but he does get the promotion to major general.
right. Well, this is the problem. Washington says no, but this is, you got to remember, right after the end of the Philadelphia campaign. Washington has a big loser on his forehead because he keeps losing all these battles, and General Gates is now the golden child who's winning battles in Saratoga and all that. So a lot of people in Congress are saying, why are we even listening to Washington? Why do we still have him as the commander? Maybe it's time for a change in leadership. Maybe we should go with a winner rather than a loser to be running things. And so when Washington says no to Conway, Congress says yes. We're going to make him a major general over over Washington's objections. Um, and not only do they make him a major general, they decide to give him a position as inspector general of the army, which basically means his job is to look at everything that Washington is doing and telling him he's doing it wrong and he needs to do it better. Which Washington already doesn't like this man, and now he's basically in this position of telling Washington what to do. Conway takes it a step further and starts kissing up to General Horatio Gates, who he sees as becoming the next commander in chief very soon. Washington's on his way out, Gates is on his way in. It's good to make nice with the new leader. So he writes a letter to Gates, which says in part, I wrote it down here: Heaven has been determined to save your country, or a weak general and bad counselors would have ruined it.
I have the
Uh,
same quote right next to me too.
it's, well, it's the one that starts the Conway cabal.
Yeah.
So it's a very famous one, yes. Um, he, and of course, by weak general, he meant General Washington. That, if God wasn't looking out for your country, Washington would have lost this war by now, is
Yeah.
essentially what he's saying.
Yeah,
Uh,
and the counselors too, which is important. So it's not only just Washington sucks at his job, but he's bad at appointing people, and he's is in a sense insulting, your Knoxes and your Greens and all these other aides de camp that he has appointed there. So it's
Right. And you have to remember, this is the way European officers were used to getting ahead. You kind of diss the other guys around you. These guys are all incompetents. You and I talking to Gates, we really know what to do, don't we, against them? Uh, so, why don't we work together and win this war for the Americans? That kind of thing. So yeah, he's dissing his what he sees as his competitors to advancement.
right. And I
Um,
understand it's not what's written in the letter that is the problem. It's the fact that everyone gets to read this letter. That's the problem.
Well, yes, the letter itself does not get out, but um, word gets out that this is what he wrote in this letter.
Okay.
And we don't know exactly why at first, how it got out or anything. And Gates gets, this is the whole Conway cabal. Gates gets apoplectic. Somebody's reading my personal mail. We need to find out who, because this is absolutely unacceptable. And Gates doesn't name him, but he strongly suspects Alexander Hamilton is the guilty party because Hamilton, who was an aide de camp to George Washington this time, had been sent up to General Gates's camp to personally tell Gates, dude, you got to send more soldiers down to Valley Forge. You can't keep hoarding them up there. You've won the battle. We need the soldiers down where the enemy is now. And Gates kept ignoring letters to that effect, so Washington sent Hamilton up to personally deal with this. And they had some rather, shall we say, tense arguments over the issue. Gates did not like taking orders from Washington, let alone some snot-nosed colonel who thought he walked on water. So the two men did not get along very well.
Well, and
But anyway,
Hamilton could be prickly himself. I understand.
exactly. So Hamilton had been in Gates's camp, and shortly after his visit, word gets out that Conway had written this really nasty letter about Washington to Gates. So Gates thinks he's going to nail Hamilton to the wall on this one. As it turned out, Hamilton had absolutely nothing to do with it. And Hamilton actually was sick during this time. He had trouble getting back to Valley Forge, and he was bedridden in northern Jersey for like a month and a half or something. So he wasn't even around to defend himself at this time. Um, as it turns out, the culprit was our favorite friend, John Wilkinson.
James.
James,
Yeah.
James Wilkinson, sorry. Um, who was kind of a slimeball extraordinaire throughout his whole career.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm not Team Wilkinson.
Oh no, I
Uh,
recently did a whole video about the slippery Jim, as I've heard him called a few times.
yeah, that's a good one. So Wilkinson goes and talks to a few other generals on his way down to from Saratoga to York to announce the victory at Saratoga. A trip that takes him like 2 months to make because he keeps stopping everywhere and chatting with people. Um, One of the people he chats with is Lord Stirling. Um, and remembers Lord Stirling is Conway's old commander, and they're talking about this stuff. And Wilkinson tells him about the letter and what Conway said to General Gates. Lord Stirling is a very strong Washington supporter during this time. I don't know if Wilkinson knew that, thought he might be able to be turned or moved into the Gates camp or something. But Stirling reports this information to George Washington. George Washington asks Gates what the heck's going on, and that's when this whole thing really blows up. Um, so Conway is still in the middle of this, trying to become the new Inspector General of the Army and working with George Washington. Washington is now seeing himself being pushed out the door by people like Conway. So it really is becoming a whole mess.
And can I ask you just to get the dates right? This is about the time they're creating the Board of War to oversee, basically a board to oversee Washington, which I know Gates finds his way onto, but I'm not sure. He's still at Saratoga in this point, so he's not quite on the Board of War yet.
Right. There's a movement within Congress to raise Gates' stock and lower Washington's. And I think that many of the delegates thought that if we keep doing these things to disrespect Washington, he'll just resign and go away, and we won't have to deal with him anymore. So we'll just keep doing these obnoxious things to him. Um, pick away at his command, take away his ability to run the army the way he wants to, and eventually he'll just throw up his hands and say, "All right, good luck, guys. I'm out of here." Washington, of course, does not do that. He starts um, right. We start the Board of War. Gates gets put on the head of the Board of War. The quartermaster of the army, Thomas Mifflin, who Washington also does not like, gets put on as second on the Board of War. Gates becomes the Inspector General. These are all um, actions that Washington does not agree with, and that basically give these officers power over Washington. So these are Washington's military subordinates who are now have the ability to basically give him orders. So it's a really messed up situation. It's one that's really insulting to Washington, and Washington tries to put up with it. After the Conway letter becomes public, Conway actually offers to resign, um, but this is actually at that point. I'm sorry, I'm getting the timing mixed up here. This is at the point at which Conway is promoted to Major General after the letter comes out. So they're really sticking it to Washington. They're saying, yeah, this guy who just screwed you, we're going to give him a big fat promotion against your will. Um,
And he's your boss.
yeah. So Conway goes to meet with George Washington in December with his new position as Inspector General and Major General, and he's going in and he's going to tell Washington what to do. And Washington basically just sits there and says, okay, punk, here you are. Say what you're going to say and get the hell out of my face. Now, of course, Washington says that very politely, very formally, very much the way a Virginia gentleman would say that to anyone. He is not specifically bad mouthing him, but he's clearly treating him like dirt as much as he can. Conway goes back to Congress and essentially says, Washington's not cooperating with me. He's not letting me do my job. I've got better things to do in France. If you guys don't want me to do this job, I'm more than happy to resign and head back to France. Um, Congress, of course, is upset by these accusations that Washington is disrespecting the Inspector General that Congress just appointed to oversee what he's doing, and they write to Washington, say, "Dude, what's up? Why are you doing this?" Um, Washington responds back with a letter to Congress, which I've also wrote down here. I'm going to read. Washington says, if General Conway means by cool receptions that I did not receive him in the language of a warm and cordial friend, I readily confess the charge. My feelings will not permit me to make professions of friendship to a man I deem my enemy. At the same time, truth authorizes me to say that he was received and treated with proper respect to his official character, and that he has no cause to justify the assertion that he could not expect any support for fulfilling the duties of his appointment. So there's Washington, Washington calling somebody an enemy who's not fighting for the British Army is pretty harsh words. Um, but he makes clear the point, I will do as I'm told. I'm not going to like it, but I will cooperate with him as required. I'm not having a tantrum. I'm not going away, but I'm not going to be happy about it. At the same time, Washington sent his response, or around the same time, he also forwarded a memorial to Congress signed by 9 brigadier generals threatening to resign because Conway had been promoted over them, just like Washington said before. You're kicking off your American generals by bypassing them for these French officers. So yeah, it was a whole mess.
But at this about this time, so not only does he send this for the brigadier generals, but all of a sudden you start seeing a gigantic slew of support from not just the other major generals, but the army at large kind of starts to make its feelings, its support of Washington known,
Right, and the army overwhelmingly supports George Washington.
which not a lot of people expected in Congress.
That took a lot of people by surprise. There were a couple of people who supported Gates, like Mifflin and Wilkinson and
Right.
Conway, but
But that's
um,
about it, they find out.
yeah, of the general officers, that really is about it.
That's the thing. My understanding is Conway and Gates thought there was a majority of the army supported them, but they quickly find out about this time. Oh no, the conspiracy is a lot smaller than even the conspirators realized.
Right, and they all thought that Gates was the hero of Saratoga. He was the man who was going to get this done, and the army would rally around him. And the army's like, no, no. And even some of the officers who fought under Gates at Saratoga were not with him. Well, certainly Arnold wasn't,
Right.
but
They all saw what Arnold did. They all knew who the real hero was.
right. And so you have a lot of very top officers who fought under Gates at Saratoga that are like, no, we want to keep Washington as commander in chief. And so Gates finds himself very isolated very quickly. But like a good soldier, he pushes ahead and tries to assert his command as head of the Board of War. And he um, starts setting up this planned invasion of Quebec. He thinks, well, now that the French have joined the war and we have all these French officers, we're going to send them up to Quebec, and the French speaking inhabitants will rally to our cause and we'll take it from the British. So Lafayette gets appointed as the head of this new army, and Conway is appointed the second in command. Two French officers leading this great new campaign, and it's going to be a glorious victory that was started by General Gates. Um, Almost immediately, the plans seem to fall apart. First of all, Lafayette says, "No, I'm not working with Conway. Conway's a jerk, and no, it's not going to happen. I want DeKalb as my second in command." Um, so Conway kind of gets pushed out. He's still up in New York, kind of getting ready for this campaign, but he's not the second in command anymore. So he's kind of there as an independent commander without a command, trying to decide what to do next. Um, the campaign is a complete mess because there's no food, there's no money, there's no uniforms, there's no guns, and there's no soldiers.
Soldiers.
Nobody shows up to have this invasion. The one guy who does show up is General Stark, who is a militia commander from New England. Um, he was supposed to originally lead the Quebec campaign before General Gates decided that French officers should be running the show. So he's put third in command, and he's already ticked off by that. And he basically shows up and go, "Okay, leaders, where are your army?" And they're like, "We thought you were bringing an army." And he's like, "Yeah, no, I'm not pulling out a bunch of militia to go invade Quebec on our own with no Continentals." So, and by the way, if I do bring an army, where's the food for them, and where are their guns, and where are the uniforms and tents and everything else we need? And they're like, "Well, we don't have all that."
And additionally, the militia doesn't have to serve outside New Hampshire if they don't want. So
Right,
why would they fight for you?
right. They can't be forced to go, but they
Right.
could be. If Stark really wanted to say, "Guys, we need to go do this," a lot of men would follow him. But he was
Absolutely.
not in the mood to do that, especially
Right.
when he's seeing they're basically going to do it all on their own, except for the commanders that are taking over for them. So, in other words, he has to make the invasion all by himself with his own men, and two other French guys are going to get the credit for it. So he's like, "No, no, not going to
I
happen."
saw what happened to Benedict Arnold. No, thank you.
So, yeah, the campaign is a complete bust. And Washington was like basically sitting back doing everything he was required to do by Congress on behalf of it, but he's basically telling everybody this is going to be a complete bust. This is going to be a complete
Right.
bust. These guys don't know what they're doing. And so he got to say at the end of it, "Yep, I was right. You were wrong." Um, the result of all this is that the Board of War is, you know, losing the confidence of Congress. They basically think, all right, these guys aren't the military geniuses who they thought they were. They're a bunch of bumbling fools who don't seem to know what they're doing. Maybe it's not so bad to have Washington in power. And Washington kind of comes out of this more powerful than ever because the people who did kind of think they could push him out and second guess him now have to say, no, Washington really is the man for this job, and there is nobody else who seems to be able to do it.
Yeah, I suppose you could argue that this is what makes George Washington, in a fashion, a larger than life character. Because this is the last real attempt for anyone to try and become the leader, the face of the revolution. And it's not. It's like from here on out, George Washington is the face.
Yeah, it's the last serious attempt. Charles Lee makes an attempt, but it
No,
goes nowhere.
come on.
Charles Lee is a prisoner of war at this point, so he never quite gets the memo when he gets back that Washington has become the man.
Charles Lee is literally planning the attack for the British at this point.
Yeah.
Anyway,
So, but yeah, so Conway, he's still Inspector General. He's got a job to do, even though, he's completely discredited at this point, and Washington obviously doesn't like him and is not going to, well, he's going to cooperate with him to the extent absolutely required by law. Um, so Conway really doesn't do anything as Inspector General. Um, this is about the time the British Army is abandoning Philadelphia. Congress is moving back in. Um, Conway goes to Philadelphia, is trying to justify everything that he did and said, and say this is all reasonable. He's actually still bad mouthing George Washington a little bit. Does not go well for him. Several people challenge him on this, want to duel with him, and he ends up actually engaging in a duel with General Cadwalader, who is a Pennsylvania militia commander of the Pennsylvania militia, essentially.
believe he's a
Um,
brigadier general at this point himself.
uh, well, he's not. He's never in the Continental Army, but he is a major general in the Pennsylvania Army.
I always confuse him with his brother. So maybe that's it.
But anyway, Cadwalader and Conway have a duel, and actually, before they have the duel, Conway resigns. He offers his resignation to Congress for like the third or fourth time. This this time, Congress says, "Yeah, sure, we'll take it. Uh, thanks for your service. Adios." But he does remain in Philadelphia for a while, and he gets into this duel with Conway. The men fire pistols at each other. Conway manages to shoot. I'm sorry, Cadwalader manages to shoot Conway in the mouth. And his comment at the time is, "I've stopped the damn rascal's tongue anyway." Um,
He
so Conway,
stands over him. Like, now I've stopped his lying, or however the quote goes.
yeah. So Conway is pretty badly injured, but he's very much alive too. He is recuperating in Philadelphia. Actually, takes the time to write a letter of apology to George Washington for everything that's happened. He thinks he's going to die, and kind of wants to get himself right with God, with history, with Washington. I don't know, but so yeah, he ends up apologizing, but he doesn't die, and he ends up sailing back to France and resumes his position in the French army.
And he has a kind of an interesting career after that. If we could breeze through that real quick. I
Yeah, he left France. He was a colonel. He rises to the rank of major general in the French army. So he's not only a major general in the Continental Army, he's a major general in the French army. And he actually does service over in India. At this time, both France and Britain had colonies on the Indian subcontinent, and Conway becomes the governor general of the French colonies
yeah,
in India.
yeah, which is a really big position. I think he's governor.
Oh,
He's in charge out there.
no, it's a very important position, and Conway's life seems to be going pretty well. And then we have the French Revolution, and as a French officer and a good French officer, um, Thomas Conway supports King Louis. And as you know, things do not go particularly well for King Louis and his supporters. So at one point, Conway is captured and imprisoned and set to be executed by the revolutionaries. I'm not sure how he managed to get out of it, whether he's released or escaped or something. It
I
very
read
well
he
could.
appealed to like his British citizenship or something of that nature at one point.
Well, that was to let him back into Britain, but
Right.
how he got out of being executed, how he got off death row in France, I'm not quite sure. The French aren't going to say, "Oh, you're a British citizen. Sure, feel free to go."
Right. You've been a French citizen for decades.
Yeah, he was more than likely under house arrest. A lot of generals and officers and gentlemen were not necessarily thrown into prison and held in chains. So he more than likely could have just gotten on a horse and ridden away. And he made it to the British lines, as you say, appealed to them based on his British citizenship, and was allowed to return to Ireland.
It probably helped having fought in the American Revolution. Yeah, at the very least, having. I mean, by then, was it Gouverneur
Helped
Morris
with
or
the
is
French.
James Monroe there at that point?
Yeah, it may have helped with the French, didn't help with the British.
Right. No, but that's what I mean. Staving off execution uh,
Yeah,
probably helped having some Americans around. Um, but it's interesting. Earlier in the conversation, you had mentioned we're not sure if he came to fight for Republican ideals or anything like that, or just wanted to make his way up. Well, here comes the French Revolution. He's most certainly fighting for the monarchy against the Republicans. So,
that's true.
yeah,
Yeah, that does say something about his politics, I guess.
right.
Um, so yeah, he ends up going back to Ireland, and he completely falls off the radar at that
Yeah,
point. This is the 1790s. Britain and France are at war. There really is no record of what happens to him or of his death, but they think historians are guessing that he died peacefully in a house around 1800, and that's kind of all we know about him.
Yeah, it's crazy. He's one of the only, I think, the only major general in the Continental Army who like disappears, and we have no idea where he goes.
Yeah, he completely
Yeah,
ghosts after his escape from France, and that's kind of the end of it. But
yeah,
we do know that he returned to Ireland, but after that, he's gone.
and inauspicious end to one of the most controversial American founders. I think I could
Yeah,
say that with pretty confidently.
yeah.
And that would turn us over to one of the least controversial American founders. Well, I guess I shouldn't say that. He's got a little bit of controversy in there. Uh, Baron Wilhelm von Steuben. I missed it. It's a long name. I can't say the whole thing.
Friedrich Wilhelm Ludolf Gerhard Augustin von Steuben.
Right. The Von, as you had called him just before we started. I usually call him Freddie Barron. Um, Baron von Steuben has himself quite a career. Now, I actually was realized today he's actually 5 years younger than Conway, and for whatever reason in my mind, I always assumed he was older. Uh, I believe because he was born. Conway was born in 1735, and Wilhelm I think was 1740. Let me double check.
No,
Oh,
no,
17. I'm
40,
wrong. Yep,
5 years later. Yeah.
my bad. But anyway, his birthday is the least important part. He is born in Prussia.
Right, and despite his long and fancy name, he is not Prussian royalty or aristocracy. His father is a captain in the Prussian army, so a substantial family. He was an officer, but not aristocracy. Um, his father, as I said, that European officers were wont to do when there wasn't fighting in their own country, went to fight with other countries. He went and fought with Russia, serving Russia against the Turks. And Friedrich went with his father. At this time, he was a child. Uh, when he turned 14, he became an aide in his father's company and served as an officer from a very early age. And he was at that time fighting in the War of Austrian Succession, which is the war before the 7 Years' War. So only the older generals for the Revolution got to fight in that one.
Right, and he's you see a bunch of the British fighting in it, but not so many of the Americans. He's a soldier from birth. I mean, I guess the term thrown around would I don't, be military brat, although I feel like that's offensive. So anyone in the military, please don't take that the wrong way. But I don't know of any other colloquial term to call it. But
Well,
yeah,
he certainly was born into the profession
yeah,
and was exposed to military life essentially from birth.
right. Like he had already essentially been in wars by the time he turns. I mean, is he even 18 when he becomes an officer? I doubt it.
Well, as I said, he was serving in as an aide at age 14.
Right.
Um, he receives a lieutenancy in the Prussian army at age 17. So he's been serving in the army for 3 years. I don't know if the Prussians had a rank lower than lieutenant. Maybe he was a cornet or something. But basically, it's one of those jobs they give to kids who look like they have a future in front of them as an officer. Um, but yeah, he receives his own command at age 17 as a lieutenant, which is still pretty young, pretty impressive.
Probably closer to what we would consider an ensign over here,
Yeah.
or at least during the Revolution. Yeah, and as you said, he's in this position for a while. I understand. I'm not, and my timeline in Prussian history is not perfect, so forgive me. But I understand he even serves as an aide de camp to uh, Frederick the Great for a year or so.
Yeah, well, he's fighting in the 7 Years' War by this time with the Prussian army, and he, uh, he serves as an aide de camp to several general officers. Um, and this is not some cushy back position. He's actually goes into several battles and is wounded twice during the war. So he's seeing action, but he's also um, given positions of responsibility. He becomes a deputy quartermaster. He rises to the rank of captain during the war, and he does get a position. Kind of, it's like for special up and coming officers with, um, um, the top leadership. So he does have some exposure to some of the top Prussian leaders during the war.
That's amazing. So again, building his credentials, arguably he ends up just the time frame we've discussed. He's like mid 20s, even at this point. So when it comes to leaders in the American Revolution, he ends up having some of the best credentials you could ever desire. Uh, he then gets a job. I'm probably mispronounce this, but he spends a good portion of his life after between the 7 Years' War and the American Revolution as a Hofmarschall.
Yes, which very loosely translated from German means boss of the house. Um, Essentially, the British term would be Chamberlain. He is
Okay.
a captain at the end of the 7 Years' War, um, which is not a particularly high rank, even though he's had exposure to some top people. But the Prussian army gets downsized after the war, and he's one of the people that gets downsized. So he has to go out and find another job, and he ends up working as a chamberlain for a very minor German aristocrat, which is a good job. Basically, his position was to be the head of the household. He would manage the staff, make any arrangements that were needed for events, make sure that supplies, food, everything was maintained for the house. A house at this time is not just a family with 4 or 5 people, and it has a staff usually of dozens of people. So it takes some management skills to run the whole thing. So that's what von Steuben was doing.
And
And
I understand it would be in charge of a locality, almost like a minor. I don't even call it a kingdom, but like a manor, like a feudal manor kind of system, where there'd be like peasants that also were under the house's guise.
right, I'm not sure the exact title of the aristocrat he worked for, but yes, it would have been somebody who owned a great deal of land and
Right.
a large building, and usually had villagers that they were responsible for maintaining order from, and um, even having a militia ready in case their services were called in time of war, that sort of thing. So there was a whole bunch to it, and it was a respectable, good job. The big problem for von Steuben is that his boss had no money. His estate was essentially bankrupt, and he couldn't afford to maintain a proper staff. He couldn't always afford to pay von Steuben. Um, and the two, von Steuben and his boss, spent a lot of time going around trying to hit up people for money to maintain the estate.
The whole point of working for a rich guy is that he's rich.
Right. The
So
one nice thing that he does get out of his um, job is that his boss likes his work and is able to give him a title of Baron. So von Steuben becomes Baron von Steuben at this time. This is about 1771, I think.
extremely minor nobility. Like
Yeah, that's like
couldn't be more minor.
this is the lowest level of aristocrat you can be, but still, you're an
You're an
aristocrat.
aristocrat. You made it.
You're in the club. Congratulations.
Right. So they go around now, these two noblemen trying to raise money, and that doesn't seem to work out very well. And I understand it's on one of these trips he's in Paris when
Right.
he is introduced to Ben Franklin.
Yes, the two of them spent a fair amount of time in Paris. Von Steuben at this point is really looking for another job because he's not getting paid. And,
Right.
he thinks money would be nice once in a while.
Imagine.
Um, so he hears that the Americans are looking for experienced officers, and he goes and has a talk with Benjamin Franklin.
And Ben Franklin says, hey, they're not really happy with all these people we've been sending over, so you're gonna have to work for free.
Well, he not only says that, he says, I can't promise you a rank at this point.
Right.
You know, um, Silas Deane had been stamping Major General on paper after paper and sending him over to Philadelphia, and Congress was saying, "Yo, stop it!"
Right.
And so uh, Franklin was a little bit gun shy about doing anything like that, and
Right.
he said, you can go over to America and make your case to Congress. And von Steuben thinks about it for a while. He's not sure if he wants to do it or not, and he's looking at his other job possibilities. One of the things that seems to be holding him back is that there are some rumors going around that he is a homosexual. And at this time in Europe, homosexuality is not only frowned upon, it's a felony, which can result in you being hanged by the neck until you are dead. So it's a very serious charge. People don't want to be associated with him. They're not sure if it's true or not, but this cloud is hanging over his head. So eventually, he does decide to go take his chances in America and see what he can do there. And he
Well,
gets Franklin to at least write him a letter of recommendation.
right, because I understand that he actually says no to Franklin, kind of, and goes back to Prussia when the charges kind of come to light. And then he goes back to France and they follow him there. And Franklin says, "We don't care in America." I mean, they did care in America, but we'll make an exception for your experience.
Yeah, well, yeah, I'm not sure how much Franklin got into that with him, but
Right.
he basically says, "Hey, you look like a good officer. We need good officers. You can go over there and make your case to them. I'll write you a letter of recommendation, and we'll see what happens."
Right.
Well, Franklin writes him a letter of recommendation, which really sells this guy as a great guy who needs to be made a general right away. And he actually, I think, claims that he's a lieutenant general or a major general in the Prussian army or something.
That's yeah what I have up here is he actually calls him a lieutenant general.
Yeah, which is
Mm,
crazy. That's a 3-star general. This guy was a captain.
yeah,
Okay, there's a slight difference there.
yeah.
It gets later it gets blamed on a translation error, but I can't imagine
I
they
don't
go from
I
captain
don't
to
think Ben Franklin had a problem with translation.
no. Ben Franklin had a problem with the truth sometimes. He liked to puff things up when he thought it was to his benefit, and that's what
The
happened to
truth was the problem. It's not Ben Franklin.
me. So, right, he goes over to America, and in
Yeah. I
1777,
actually want to ask you if you've heard of this. I heard this little anecdote, but I've never seen it verified. I
mhm,
When he arrives, I guess he comes through Portsmouth in New Hampshire, and when he arrives, I guess he outfitted his entourage in red uniforms, and he's almost arrested because they think he's British because he didn't realize he was supposed to wear blue.
I hadn't heard that one, but it doesn't surprise me.
I've seen it in places. I've never confirmed it, but I've seen it from unreliable sources. So we'll leave it at that. That's why I
Right.
wanted to ask you if you've heard about it because it's hilarious, but I don't know how true it is.
Yeah, there are a whole lot of problems he has on his way to getting to Congress. He eventually makes his way to Boston, and he's celebrated by some people. I think the Adamses have him over for dinner, and he actually meets some French officers in Boston who are on their way home, who had been down to see Congress, and Congress said thanks, but no thanks, please leave. And they're on their way out the door while he's coming in. He's kind of thinking, what did I get myself into? He came over to America only by borrowing money from other people, thinking that he was going to come over here and get a real good paying job and start making his way in the world again. And not only is he heavily in debt, but he's going to have to pay for a way to get back to Europe if this gig doesn't work out. So he's very nervous heading down to York to speak with the Continental Congress.
And he gets there just about the time the Conway cabal is going down, which I'm glad you said York. We should remind everyone that this is all happening in the temporary capital of York, Pennsylvania.
Right. This is the winter of 1777, 78. Congress is in York, Washington is in Valley Forge, and the British are in Philadelphia.
And
And Thomas Conway is trying to kick George Washington out of his position.
right, they're
All,
forming the Board of War.
all while von Steuben is showing up saying, "Hey guys, I'm here to help."
Oh, and by the way, the Continental Army is starving to death and eating their shoes.
Right.
So Steuben shows up, and Congress says,
He shows up and talks to Congress, and Congress is like, "Dude, seemed like a nice guy. We don't have a lot of money right now. Not sure we can put you on the payroll." So von Steuben says, "All right, how about if I work on spec? I'll um, I'll serve as a gentleman volunteer, which is basically something that You couldn't get an officer's commission, but you weren't a lowly enlisted man either. You were kind of somebody who should be an officer, the man of that social and economic class, but you didn't actually have the authority of an officer. So he agrees to serve as a gentleman volunteer until he can prove his worth to the Continental Army.
Right. And I understand the
Um,
agreement is he'll get paid after the war based on his service.
he says that he wants a promise that he would get, I think it was 600 guineas a year as a pension after the war if his services were proven valuable. A guinea is worth a little bit more than a British pound. So 600 guineas, I don't know, maybe that's like 650, 700 pounds, something like that a year. You have to remember that at this time, the average working man in America lived on about 30 pounds a year. So this is a lot of money. He's asking for a very generous pension after the war. But one thing Congress likes about pensions is that they don't have to pay them now. It's only a promise for later. And Congress is like making promises for later rather than paying money now.
Because they
They're
could
like,
just take out loans then.
right, yeah, we'll see what we can do for you later. But if you want to come fight for us now, we can do it. They actually don't let him fight as a gentleman volunteer. They give him a commission as a captain in the Continental Army, and um, von Steuben is actually a little insulted by that because he does not want to be stuck in some lowly position. And they basically explain to him that the reason they're doing it is not because that's the position they want to put him in or keep him in, but that if he is captured by the British Army, he needs to have a position that he'll be treated as an officer and a prisoner of war, and so giving him a captaincy will afford him that protection.
Fair enough. So the first thing he does is he stumbles up to Valley Forge.
Right, he heads up to Valley Forge, and George Washington personally comes out to greet him with his fellow officers, as he enters Valley Forge. So he's given a great deal of respect by the Continental Army. All these people think that he was a lieutenant general in the Prussian army. So he's this really impressive figure who's going to come in and really do some amazing stuff for them.
Well, I understand he cuts an impressive figure too. Like
He
when you
looks
look at
very
him, he
impressive.
looks like he should be a general.
He's a big man. He has a very impressive uniform with lots of ribbons and medals on it. So yeah, he at first glance looks like an impressive guy. Um, at Valley Forge, he ends up serving as effectively the inspector general, the job that Conway actually has at this point. Washington wants an inspector general, which is basically the guy who's going to tell Washington what he's doing wrong. And Washington knows that Valley Forge is a mess, not necessarily his fault, but it's a mess. People are starving to death, they're dying of disease, they're, as you say, eating their shoes. It's not a pretty picture. And von Steuben is interesting in that he goes around and actually talks to the enlisted men and asks them, what's your biggest problems? What within our abilities can we do for you? And this is something that even American officers generally do not do. You don't talk about this stuff with enlisted men. So von Steuben is immediately going in there and trying to get to the root of the problem by talking to people. And you got to remember, this is a guy who doesn't even speak English, so it's a difficult thing for him to do.
Right.
Most of what he does at this point, he does speak French. So he gets a couple of Continental officers who speak French. And so he's speaking to them in a second language to him and a second language to them. And then they're translating his French into English. And then the English speaker will say it back to them. Then they'll translate it into French for him. So it's a very stilted and complicated way to do things. But it does put him into contact with two of Washington's top aides right away, Alexander Hamilton and John Loring, who were both colonels and aides de camp to General Washington, perform a lot of these translation services and are going around Valley Forge with him, talking to all these people and kind of getting the feel for what's going on.
Right. Which helps Hamilton himself in his later career, to a degree, being familiar with the men themselves, just like von Steuben.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely, it's a good thing, and
I
it's a
I know
the
during a certain mutiny, I think it's the 1783, people recognized Alexander Hamilton, which was important.
Yeah, yeah. Hamilton is in a lot of ways Hamilton almost becomes the face of George Washington for a lot of his career because he, as I said, he's a direct aide to Washington. He speaks on behalf of Washington many times, like when he went up to talk with General Gates. He writes many of Washington's letters. They're in Alexander Hamilton's handwriting and then signed by Washington. So he is the face of Washington. He's going out and he's with General von Steuben talking to these soldiers, essentially being the face of the military commander in chief.
So von Steuben, in this scenario, uh, he ends up doing a whole slew of things, as you said, kind of acting as Inspector General, but just totally overhauling not just the camp, the American Army. We can get into specifics, but he gets there in late February of '78, I believe it is,
Yeah,
and then they don't come out of winter quarters until mid June. So in just about 4 months, he makes the Continental Army.
yeah. A few weeks after his arrival and his discussions with the soldiers, he submits a report to General Washington, and the report is a fairly blunt assessment, basically saying everything you're doing is wrong and the whole army's a mess. And but he's he backs it up with a lot of specifics.
Yeah,
And Washington is actually grateful for this. Washington does not always take um, condemnation lightly, but in this case, he kind of agrees with von Steuben. Yes, everything is a mess, and how do we fix it? And von Steuben often offers a lot of solutions. A lot of it's really basic stuff, like stop peeing in your tents and stuff like that because you're spreading disease. He has men digging proper trenches for going to the bathroom, and
and he changes the whole outline of camp. He puts the kitchens on the opposite side of camp from the bathrooms, put the bathrooms downhill.
right,
Seems like common sense to us, but not in the 18th century.
rearranging everything and making a punishable offense not to use the latrine trenches, which you have to remember that's a big thing for guys who are barefoot in sub-zero weather and have no clothing, and having to make a 100-yard march to take a whiz is not necessarily the most pleasant thing in the world. But he's impressing on them that this is important because you guys are all dying of
It's
disease.
better than cholera. Yeah.
Right, there's thousands of Continental soldiers who die at Valley Forge, mostly from diseases that are could have been prevented. So yeah, that's a big part of what he does is cleaning up the camp and providing some degree of cleanliness for purposes of health reasons.
Right. I
The other thing he does is he wants to start training and drilling the men so they can act like an actual army and not a rabble of guys with guns. And to do this, he starts with a model company, which I think is a little over 100 men, which he draws from all the other regiments that are in Valley Forge at the time, including part of Washington's Life Guard. The Life Guard are what we would today call his bodyguards, I guess. They're an elite group of soldiers who are designed to protect the president, or not the president, the general commander in chief, and to serve as a kind of an honorary guard as well. They need to look good and march right and all those sorts of things.
commanded by Caleb Gibbs. Shout out Caleb Gibbs.
There you go. So he takes this mix of people from all these different regiments, and they actually couldn't pick them at random. They had to pick ones that actually had pants and shoes and were not so sick that they couldn't stand up. So that really limited the number of people they could choose from for this model position. But he begins drilling them, and of course they're a mess, and he, is getting frustrated and swearing at them and all this sort of thing. And
Right. I
of
understand
course,
that's the English he speaks, is he can say some cuss words, and
well,
that's about
he
it.
learned the swear words right away. One of the famous things he says is when he's starting this, he's working through his translators, and he tells his translators, "Just swear at the men in English for me." Um, you have to remember though, Valley Forge, as bleak in existence as it is there's really not a whole lot going on. Men are basically just trying to survive the winter and not doing a whole lot else. So they're bored. You got a bunch of young guys sitting around camp, bored to death. So they turn out to kind of watch the drills that are going on. So he kind of gets this audience going on around him, and he recognizes that when he starts swearing and yelling at the men, the audience is laughing at him, and he's getting look at the crazy old German screaming at us. So he kind of plays into it, and he starts blustering more and more just because he knows that will make for good entertainment for the men. But he does teach this model company how to drill properly. And the idea is that once these guys know the drill, they're going to go back to their companies and they're going to be the teachers that teach it to the rest of the army. And so that's what happens over a period of weeks. And he really focuses more on just teach them how to march in step and move from columns to lines and the basic things. He doesn't really focus on European soldiers are taught to a series of commands to like load and fire their guns and stuff like that. He figures, these guys already know how to fire a gun. What they really need to do is learn how to march as a unit, and so that's really what he focuses on.
I
And
do understand he did teach them to use the bayonets uh, more than anything else. Until he showed up, the bayonets were basically for opening cans. And not that they had cans yet, but you know what I mean, like cooking meat on. I understand he really pushed for them to say, no, you need the bayonets, and that's why later we see in the army certain attacks with unloaded rifles to maintain the silence in the attack.
yeah, he did enforce the idea of bayonet drill. You have to remember that a musket could only be fired 3 or 4 times a minute. It was and it was horribly inaccurate. So typically, what European armies would do is they'd fire a round or two and then they'd charge in and hand-to-hand combat with the bayonet. The Americans were not big on that. Part of that was inexperience. Part of it was a lot of them didn't have guns with bayonets, so they just if you wanted to use a bayonet, you didn't have one.
Well, speaking of that. Sorry not to interrupt, but that's another thing I read about Baron von Steuben did was he nothing was accounted for when he showed up, and he essentially told Washington, "You need to start keeping your books. We need to know how many guns we actually have. There might not be a lot of food, but we need to keep track of how much food there is and things of that nature."
Yeah, Washington had tried to do that from the beginning, but it kind of became a mess, especially when they were marching in campaigns. And yeah, he had kind of given up on it. And von Steuben's like, no, this really is important. Um, so he became he was whipping the army into shape. The soldiers seemed to know it and appreciate it, and he became a fairly popular officer fairly quickly, despite the fact that he didn't even speak English. Because he was listening to the soldiers and he was doing things, he was accomplishing things that were, improving their quality of life, and probably more importantly, improving their ability to defeat the British the following spring. So everybody kind of knew that and appreciated it. He was, as I said, a friendly guy. He would try to entertain the troops. He would throw parties at his house for minor officers. He had something called sans culottes parties, which means literally without pants. Um, it's a little misleading term because during the
Okay.
French Revolution, sans culotte was a radical party that was giving up culottes, which was essentially knee breeches for more casual 19th century pants.
Right.
That's where the sans culottes party, but literally it means without pants. And
Right.
he would hold these parties supposedly because many of the junior officers didn't have pants. They had been worn out. They were essentially wearing rags that you would not attend a party in this way. You were just simply weren't presentable. And he was like, kind of, no, guys, come as you are. We'll hang out. We'll
Right.
have fun. We'll drink some beer and whiskey. It'll be a good time. Um, the fact that he was a homosexual probably didn't hurt the fact he didn't want a bunch of the young officers without pants hanging around in his house. But
Yeah, what are you gonna
we
do?
got to say there was a good reason for it beyond that. So, but anyway, yeah, he became very popular with the soldiers, um, and General Washington appreciated what he was doing, and he reached out to Congress and said, "Hey, you guys got to make Captain von Steuben Major General von Steuben." And while you're at it, why don't we give him the job of Inspector General that Tommy Conway doesn't seem to be doing? Well,
Yeah,
Conway, by the way, was out in Philadelphia, or well, no, I guess he wasn't in Philadelphia because the British were still there in the spring, but he was not around Washington. I think he went up to New Jersey for a while, and
right.
you know, he wasn't
Well,
around.
and before we even move on to that, we should also mention that at Valley Forge, he writes the Blue Book, which is, I forget the full title. It's the manual, the official manual of the United States.
No, that actually happens later. Um,
Oh, I thought it was at Valley Forge.
no, he doesn't write it at Valley
Oh,
Forge.
my
He
mistake.
he is basically training without a manual and
Right.
doing the whole thing basically from memory. He doesn't actually use strictly um, Prussian tactics. He varies them. He's an innovator. He's kind of changing things up. He tries to make it more practical for the Americans. One of the things he very quickly notices, he writes to a fellow officer in Europe later about this. He says, in Europe, if you're an officer, you tell the men do this and they do it. In America, you have to say, this is why we do it, now do it, and then they do it. You have to kind of explain everything to the Americans, make them think it's reasonable. They're not just going to blindly obey you. And he understands that and he adopts it and he works with it. And he's making these men into an army and customizing it to the needs of the Americans.
He literally builds his own
Right. I mean,
army.
he 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 sends out his model company. The model soldiers train the other officers in their regiments, and by spring, they're all ready to march in step and move from columns to lines and keep their positions and all the things that you'd expect from a real army to
Yeah,
do.
disease is down. They can keep track of everything, and morale is up. That's hard to underestimate.
Yeah.
It's like they say in sports, that intangible that you don't see on the scoreboard, but it's von Steuben's 4 months. His first 4 months with the Continental Army are impossible to underestimate or overestimate.
Right. And one of the things that also happens during the winter at Valley Forge is they get word in the spring that the French have joined the war, that they've signed a treaty with the Americans. And so Washington calls on the army to have a big parade in Valley Forge, which basically means they all turn out in their units and march in step and look impressive. And von Steuben choreographs the whole affair, and the men come out and they really look like a real army and impress everyone. And that night at a party, General Washington goes to von Steuben and congratulates him on his job and says, "Oh, by the way, last week Congress promoted you to Major General and made you Inspector General of the Army. So congratulations."
Yeah, thanks. Because now he's getting paid too, like a major general.
Well,
I
yeah,
I
but
would presume.
he was entitled to the pay of a Major General. Whether anyone ever got paid in the Continental Army is a whole other question.
Well, that's a different story now, isn't it? So he goes to war, and he's pretty successful.
He
Imagine
goes
that.
to war. He takes men out. They fight the Battle of Monmouth using his tactics. He's not very directly involved in the front lines of that battle, but his work is very much appreciated. And yeah,
It's a new army. The British realize they're facing a new army.
they are facing a professional army that they had never seen before. Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing. Uh, and then over the course of 78, I'm sure
Yeah.
there are more battles that are eluding me right now.
The next winter, he actually leaves the army. He goes to Philadelphia and spends the winter writing the Manual of Arms that we were just talking about a minute ago. So that's when he does it, the year after Valley Forge. Um, After that,
Right. Well, just before we move on, this
yeah,
is a really important step because the Manual of Arms, which is commonly known as the Blue Book, that ends up being the manual for the United States until essentially the Civil War. At least through the war of the Mexican American War. I know that for certain.
yeah, it's pretty much unchanged through the War of 1812. There are some minor adaptations to it, but right, it really doesn't get completely rewritten until the Civil War.
Right. So even after the Continental Army dissolves and we have a constitution and they form the Legion of the United States, which becomes the United States Army, they're still well after his death using Baron von Steuben's instructions to create the United States army. I like to harp on that just to like throw the weight of his career to like just I don't know how to say it to give it the gravitas it truly deserves.
Yeah, I mean, he really had a fundamental effect on generations of the army.
Yeah.
No doubt.
All right. Continue. Sorry.
Um, so by 1779, or I guess 1780, he we have a war going on in the South by this time, and of course, General Lincoln is captured at Charleston. General Gates goes down and embarrasses himself and loses a second army, and the Continentals have to send a third army under General Nathaniel Greene to replace the two armies that they've already lost. And General von Steuben goes down and serves under Nathaniel Greene in the Southern Command.
Right. I understand he's primarily in Virginia at first, kind of not authorizing troops, but overseeing the troops arriving from the north. He's the one kind of instructing them on where to find Green and things like that.
Yeah, von Steuben was never really a field commander. He was in the field a few times, but that wasn't his real strength. His strength really was as a logistics officer and coordinating things and getting food to the men and making sure the units were going where they were supposed to be going, that sort of thing. So he kind of ran a lot of behind the scenes stuff for General Greene's army, and by all accounts did a pretty impressive job of it.
He does, unless I'm skipping ahead, join everyone for the party at Yorktown.
He is one of three division commanders at Yorktown, so this is actually one place where he does take to the field and leads his men quite competently and well. Yeah, at the final major battle of the war.
And that's that. War won.
The war won, the war is over. Von Steuben has to now decide what to do with the rest of his life. And one of the things he does is he goes to the Confederation Congress and say, "Hey, congratulations on the war. You're welcome. Where are my 600 guineas a year?"
Yeah. Money,
And they're
please.
yeah, they're like, "Dude, we have no money." You know that. How long have you been here? You know we don't have any money. Where do you think we're going to get all this gold to pay you? I don't know.
Right.
Um,
So he does find himself at Newburgh with a large group of other generals who are in exactly the same not getting paid boat.
yeah, so he is kind of down on his luck again. One thing the Congress and some of the states can do for him is give him land, um, and he does get a bunch of land grants, including a pretty nice estate in northern New Jersey um, that was taken from a Tory and is kind of handed over to him, lock, stock, and barrel. He's got the buildings and the slaves and the horses and the land and everything, and it's a pretty nice place. But he really doesn't have the money to run it. And actually, one of the conditions of him being given the plantation was that he actually lived there. He does live there for a short time, but quickly realizes that he can't run it and ends up selling it and moving back to New York City.
Well, I think he lives there for like an extra month past the time he was supposed to live there, and
Yeah,
as soon as he can leave, he sells it. And what's interesting, I forget the name, but the Tory they took it from, he sells it to one of their kids. So he actually
yeah,
sells it back to the family that lost it, and it stays in the family for quite some time.
yeah, I think that's right.
No.
But like any sensible person, von Steuben got out of New Jersey as quickly as he could.
Oh no! Don't say that, man. You live right on the border.
I live in New
Oh,
Jersey,
you
so I
do live over the. Oh, okay, that's right. That's right. I always forgot because you're in the greater Philly area, right?
yeah, I live in southern New Jersey myself.
Fair enough. Well, time to get out. Right. So he does get
Um,
out. We did skip this too. When they create the Society of the Cincinnatus, which is I think you had to be at least an officer in the war, if not like some kind of general. I forget the rank you had to achieve.
any Continental officer,
Okay.
lieutenant on up, could join. Yes,
Right. And von Steuben is the presiding officer at the meeting which creates it.
that's right. They
Yeah.
give command of the society to George Washington, but von Steuben is one of the men who helps establish it and
Right.
appointing George Washington as its head.
Right. Washington seems to keep his distance a little bit because the a lot of people were criticizing the whole idea of the society because we don't want nobility in this country, and you're basically making it hereditary, no, to stay
Yeah,
in. So
a lot of Republicans, and I mean that in the generic sense, people who supported a republic as opposed to an aristocracy, were very upset at the idea of the society, which, as you say, was a hereditary organization. Children of Continental officers would take positions within the society, and it was this kind of outside military organization that was separate from civilian rule. So people kind of really looked askance at it, and Washington joined it and became its head, but he was a little skeptical of himself, but at least as how it was going to appear to the rest of the country.
exactly. But either way, an important organization that,
Exists to this day, by the way.
yeah, absolutely, despite being hereditary. I think
And
they
you know,
have opened it up to daughters at this point, where it doesn't just have to be a son. I don't quote me on that, but I'm pretty sure to keep it alive, they've become more lenient on just the oldest son.
I don't know the details of it, but
I've only read a
yeah,
little bit
it,
about
it
it.
is it is still a hereditary organization. I
Yep.
would have been much happier to see it become a real veterans organization where veterans of any war could join it and their kids had to be veterans themselves before they could join. But I guess they don't take my advice on these things.
No, no,
Um,
you're 200 years too late.
so it is a hereditary organization. It does exist to this day, and they actually do a lot of American Revolution preservation and keeping the memory alive of the American Revolution and the deeds of their ancestors. So it does a lot of good work.
Oh yeah, I in no way intend to insult the organization as it exists now, but I'm just primarily commenting on how it was viewed at the time. And importantly, again, von Steuben, one of the initial leaders.
Right. So yeah, von Steuben um, lives in New York for a while, in New York City. Eventually finds it a little too expensive to stay in the city and maintain a house and all that. He moves up to the Mohawk Valley where he has an estate of, I forget, it's over 100,000 acres. It's this really huge estate, in the middle of the wilderness, basically part of the land they took from the Iroquois during the war.
Yeah,
Um,
it is. I live just west of it. Um, so that's actually more Oneida land, who were on America's side during the war, though obviously some of their land went to Americans. Um,
yeah, the Oneida got treated pretty harshly after the war, but that's a whole nother
that's a
story.
whole nother story. Yeah, it
Like
sucks.
in Wisconsin or something.
Right. Yeah, unfortunately. But that's the area moves. Which I guess they were Iroquois. You're right. They were one of the nations of the Iroquois, but
Yeah.
supposed to be one of the friendly ones. um, that being said, he does relocate up here, and I understand that we mentioned the New Jersey property earlier. Selling, he ran off a bunch of debts in New York City before moving to the Jersey property, and it was selling off the New Jersey property paid for both that and the debts from New York City. And I understand he lived relative, despite all the acreage, relatively modestly for the rest of his life.
Yeah, and one of the things that is interesting about his life is he lives with two of his junior officers who had served with him during the war, um, Benjamin Walker and William North. These were both uh, much younger men than him, I don't know, 20 or 30 years younger than him, and they are believed to have been homosexual lovers of General von Steuben. As I said, homosexuality was very taboo at the time and couldn't be done openly, but von Steuben was about as open as you could get at the time about his sexuality, and it was kind of an open secret. Von Steuben adopted both of these men, so they became his adopted children. The reason for that was the only way um, gay men could have a familial relationship with each other. He had an estate, and he wanted to leave it to these men, and the only way he could do that was through adoption. So they um, lived with him throughout the rest of his life. Both of the men actually went on to get married and have children.
Yeah.
So, um,
I don't know a ton about the one gentleman, but I know North ends up he continues as an aide. I think he's aide or chief of staff for Alexander Hamilton when under the Adams administration he takes over command of the United States Army. I believe he becomes a major general in
yeah,
the
becomes a
in the
general in
War of
1812.
1812. Is that it? Yeah. So
Yeah, so yeah, he goes on to have quite a career of his own.
yeah, he's
And
also the one who sells the New Jersey property.
okay.
Sorry.
Um,
I've been reading
so
about North. He's going to be the founder of the day soon. So that's why I know a little bit more than I otherwise might about that particular candidate.
okay. Um, yeah, so yeah, as I said, both of them got married and had children of their own, and they actually named some of their children after von Steuben. They had a very close relationship with this man. We kind of assume it was sexual, but as I said, that they obviously left no record of that. But that was his family legacy as much as he could have for a man that never got married.
Right. Yeah, no, yeah, it's fascinating. It is really, and I would assume part of it is that Steuben was just such a gigantic figure in his day that, you know, metaphorically, that that's why the Americans would overlook something that, as we said, not commonly overlooked. It's not like they came to America from France because you can be gay here. Like it was
No, no, it was a capital offense in America,
right.
um, but America. First of all, he obviously had a lot to offer the army in terms of his military knowledge and experience, and he was really just a really likable guy, and so he kind of got into this whole "don't ask, don't tell" experience for the Continental Army. It was kind of an open secret. Everybody kind of knew what was going on, but nobody really pressed the issue because he's a nice guy, and whatever he does in the bedroom is we're
Right.
not going to ask questions about.
And he wasn't really going around talking about it. I guess he was having those no pants parties, but like, he wasn't
But again,
flaunting it.
there was a legitimate reason for those beyond any sexual proclivities, and it wasn't like he was being obvious and doing things publicly that would raise the ire of the homophobes of the day or something.
Right, exactly.
So he kept it quiet. He kind of kept it to himself. It kind of was an open secret what was going on, but that was the way a homosexual was forced to live in the 18th century.
Right. And as we said, before we wrap up on him, in those even just in those few months at Valley Forge, the guy shows up out of nowhere, looks like a master. I read him being like compared to Mars, the Greek god, not the planet. Well, I guess one and the same. And just shows up, doesn't speak English except some curse words. He organizes the camp. He stops guys from getting wildly sick by moving the bathrooms in the kitchen. He trains a few guys to go out and train the rest of the army, and suddenly we have an army because this weird Prussian dude showed up out of nowhere. And then also wrote the Blue Book. Like you said, it's hard to underestimate what he did.
Yeah, I mean, of maybe a half dozen people, he probably had the greatest impact on the Continental Army and the U.S. Army of anybody. Yeah,
Yeah.
he was a very important figure, not just a two-star general somewhere on a list.
Right. It's actually surprising he's this far down our list, but we're doing him chronologically, not
Right,
based on merit.
right. His seniority had to do with the fact that he didn't show up in America until 1777.
Yeah, exactly. Well, as we round it out, is there anything else about von Steuben you find interesting you'd like to share?
No, I think we pretty well covered it.
Yeah, we give him about a full hour. I think that should do it. Well, Michael, thank you so much for coming back. I believe we only have one, maybe 2 more weeks left. Depends how we decide to squeeze them in. But thank you so much.
Pleasure as always.